Yeah, I just think it raises an interesting question about impact in general. Um, and I've wanted to ask you this for a few weeks because we both love Derek White, right? Derek White is one of the best role play, if not the best role player in the league. You know, if you're a Knicks fan listening to this who doesn't watch a lot of Celtics, just imagine if Emmanuel Quickly was a more consistent shooter and a better on-ball defender. That's what Derek White is. He's incredible. My question for you would be: do you think how do you discern between absolute impact in what you're doing in the role you're playing versus replaceability? And what I mean by that is if you put, Danny Green is a great example to me. I think Danny Green, his absolute impact in his career is probably underrated historically. But I do think that what Danny Green did in that role is probably easier to replace than a lead initiator. And so I'm going to bring it back to the Celtics, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Jaylen Brown versus Derek White. And I'm just going to send it over to you because I think it's a really interesting discussion. I think that me and you would both agree that Derek White is more impactful in his role than Jaylen Brown is in his role. I think that's pretty reasonable to say, even if some people might laugh at that. Oh, Jaylen Brown's an all-star, yada yada. But I do think that it would be tougher to replace the style of what Jaylen Brown does versus what Derek White does. And maybe that's a bad example because Derek White is so elite at what he does. But I hope you stay within what I'm trying to say. I mean, stylistically, it's tougher to replace a primary initiator who can do that very well versus a role player who's trying really hard on defense and a good shooter. So how do you weigh those things, replaceability versus immediate impact?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And my answer is probably complicated and not fully fleshed out in my own mind. But in my opinion, I think we overestimate how replaceable some of these off-ball players are. I think that it seems like, oh yeah, we can just, I know Derek White is like the peak of this, but like we can just get a guy like Derek White, right? That should be easier to find than a guy like Jaylen Brown who does all this stuff like on the ball and like that feels like it would be much more easy to replace. I don't think that is true. I think if these guys were super replaceable, there would be more of them around the league. I think that because I think that when we talk about someone like Derek White, it's not just the fact that he's making threes and playing defense. There are so many other things that he does so tremendously well. His on-ball defense and his off-ball defense, his awareness, his communication on offense, his ability to cut, his ability to be in the right place all the time, to fill space, to fill gaps and fill space correctly, to fill the lane correctly, to move to the right spot, to generate the right passing windows, not just for himself, but for other teammates. There are all these intangible things that are happening. It's not just like a guy who makes 40% of his threes and who can play defense on ball. It's like there are so many other things that are happening. And when we start to like pinpoint all of these intangible things that a player like Derek White is doing, or even a player who's not as good as Derek White at those things, but like those types of things, I don't think it's replaceable because I think that there would be a ton of guys across the league doing it. And if that was the case, their impact would be lower, right? To me, their impact would be lower because we would see a replacement level player, like that is what impact is kind of being graded against, the kind of average NBA player or a replacement level player. Then those guys would be better. And so then the relative to a replacement level player, their impact would be lower. But the fact that I just don't think that there are a lot of those guys that exist. And I think impact metrics try to account for this. And I think they actually are underselling the importance of those roles because like I said, when you take a guy and you put a guy like LeBron on the ball constantly and his usage goes through the roof, and not just his usage as a self-creator, but a playmaker for others, his impact will often be higher than when he comes off the ball and has less of that responsibility. And so to me, I think when we talk about replaceability, we have to then define and understand like how replaceable are these guys. I don't think we can use kind of like our intuitions to say, well, I think it'd be easier to replace what Derek White or a lesser version of Derek White does than it would be to replace what an on-ball creator like Jaylen Brown does. I just don't think so. I think NBA players are so ridiculously talented. I think that they're incredibly talented, and I think there are a lot of guys who can do stuff on the ball and generate shots probably more than we give that credit for. And there are less guys who can do so much stuff off the ball on both sides of the court. And we kind of underestimate or overestimate how easy it is to replace those guys. That's kind of how I view it. I think it's like a sort of like a bias on both ends. And so I think if you accounted for the bias on both ends, we would find that it's actually like pretty similarly valuable.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I felt an immense amount of pride watching the game with my dad yesterday. I don't know if you remember, but there was a play where RJ Barrett was face guarding Devin Booker really high up, and Devin Booker went backdoor and then Euro'd past quickly for a layup.
Yeah.
And my dad was like, literally like out loud, he was just like, man, Quickly's amazing. And I just kind of turned to him and I was like, what? Like, he just gave up. And he was just like, how many other players in the league are even there to stunt like
would
that?
Would even be there. Yeah. That's
would even be in that spot. Yeah. And I was just like, I've watched a lot of basketball with my dad. Let's go. Like at least one other person is starting to get it.
That's awesome. That's a really awesome observation. And I think is those kinds of things that it's like in a vacuum, it feels like, oh yeah, that guy should be replaceable. But it's like, yeah, how many other guys would even be there to like lower the percentage chance that Booker makes that shot, or make it more difficult for Booker, or have a lesser player than Booker not be able to make that shot, right? Like Booker is so freaking skilled that it looks easy. Like, I'm just going to Euro around this guy and just score. Like, but another player besides Devin Booker who's not at that level might have a lot more trouble finishing over that, quickly be in the right place and making a really solid contest without fouling. So to me, there are all these little minor, minuscule subtleties and nuances that are really hard to observe. And even the ones that we do observe, it's like, wow, that's dope that we noticed that. But like, there are so many other things that are happening that we don't, that are really hard to perceive. And on top of that, not only is it difficult to be a lead initiator, but that's really good and impactful. But to be a lead initiator that's really good and impactful and not overly ball dominant to the point of diminishing returns, that's another aspect that I think is a difficult balance, right? So that's on the other end of the like lead initiator. It's like being hard to replace. You can get a guy who is really good at kind of initiating the offense and being a playmaking ball dominant guy, but like how many of them are good enough that they're not kind of like going overboard or kind of doing too much relative to the value that they're contributing? I mean, Julius Randle is like the case of that, right? Like and so yeah, I think that's part of it as well.